Planet X Games is back with a new spin on an old favorite. Jungle Tomb of the Mummy Bride is coming to Kickstarter Tuesday, May 25th, now compatible for the Dungeon Crawl Classics rule set. The Dungeon Crawl Classics compatible version of Jungle Tomb of the Mummy Bride is designed for a group of 4 to 6 third-level characters and can be used for campaign play and as a one-shot non-competitive module, but also works equally well as a tournament scenario. The Dungeon Crawl Classics compatible edition of Jungle Tomb of the Mummy Bride is now available for the first time in print, both as a hardcover collector's edition and as a softcover adventure scenario. Identical in tone and feel to all those classic DCC modules we've all come to know and love. So be sure to check out the DCC compatible edition of Jungle Tomb of the Mummy Bride from Planet X Games on Kickstarter May 25th.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. He came at me with something so obscure, I don't even have a joke for it. Stu Horvath.
It's the king in Conan.
Fair enough. How did I miss that? You know, sometimes you come up with these topics, and there's always something in the name that I could spin or turn, but you told me this, and I was like, So, Stu, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about Osric.
Osric. Yeah, I got nothing. Eventually, maybe later in the episode, you are going to get a joke, but I'm not quite there yet, man. So, for those like me who are not familiar with Osric, what is it?
So Osric is arguably the beginning of the larger OSR movement. Sort of. Kinda.
Is that because OSR is in the name? Is that what we're happening here? Or?
I mean, like everything else with the OSR, sure. There's nothing firm, no firm answers to be found when it comes to OSR.
It's a mystery.
Even the decisive moment, its creation, is debatable. You could throw it back 2 years prior to Castles and Crusades in 2004. Even though that's not a retro clone system, they were trying to emulate the feel of the older D&Ds using the 3.0 rules.
But wasn't Castles and Crusades Gary Gygax?
Yes, it was. It was a very modified 3.0 D&D.
So is that like D&D Inception, where you have the creator of D&D going and working within a different framework of D&D that evolved out of his D&D to now make a quote-unquote new D&D?
Yeah, it's super hard to kind of untangle these threads because of stuff like that. And Castles and Crusades comes out of like a larger problem with D&D 3.0. You know, like they made the D20 system. We've talked a little bit about this here and there on the podcast. Basically, D20 was their plan to kind of use the third edition D&D rules as a universal system. You could run anything with it, all be intercompatible. And it was a great idea for a while. And to do this, they did two things. They created the open gaming license, which supported the D20 system trademark. The idea being that now, using the open gaming license, you can use the 3.0 rules, which were never copywritten to begin with. You can't copyright rules. But basically, the OGL is saying, like, you could do this now and nobody's going to hassle you over it. You could fiddle with our rule system. And that's in support of the D20 trademark, which allows you to kind of publish and say, like, all these things are compatible, right?
Right.
D20, there's a million source books come out almost instantaneously. People are just capitalizing on the fact that, like, I'm not D&D, but I can make D&D stuff and people will buy it. And it's like this frenzy and the market gets oversaturated. There's quality control issues and the trademark becomes sort of like poison. Nearly destroys the entire role-playing industry because so many people overcommitted to the D20 system to begin with. But you have a whole bunch of publishers who are sort of left with this choice. Do we continue to publish under the D20 system trademark, which is poisonous, or do we just kind of like ditch that, still make 3.0 compatible stuff under the OGL? Now, this is sort of like a gray area And that's where Castles and Crusades comes in. It's a 3.0 compatible game, uses system reference document, which is basically pure mechanics of 3.0 to build this game. They tinker with the mechanics to give it the feel of the original Dungeons and Dragons, the white box. And suddenly, a whole bunch of other people are like, wait a minute, if they use the OGL to make a 3.0 game that emulates OD&D, why don't we use the OGL to make games that are OD&D or basic or AD&D first edition? Like all of a sudden, like people realized, wait, they're not going to sue us over 3.0. They're totally not going to sue us over anything else.
So that's how they got away with murder.
Yeah. So the thing is, you can't copyright mechanics. You can't copyright a method, the way a thing works, right? But you can copyright the way in which you explain the method or the way things work. So Osric takes the mechanics of first edition D&D, all three core books, Player's Guide, DM Guide, and Monster Manual, puts them all under one cover, strips out all of the description, anything that Gygax wrote, explaining how the system works, and writes it all over again using new, fresh prose. So there's no argument that they're using words that Gary Gygax used to describe this system that are copywritten. They do it all over again. And the idea here, it's not really player facing. I don't think that there was really an intention for people to play Osric. I think that the intention was that people were going to play using their old school first edition books. The intention here was to create a reference book, and that's what Osric stands for. It's School Reference and Index Compilation. The idea here is to put all of these rules in one place, put them under a Creative Commons license, create their own trademark called Osric, like the D20 system that will kind of let people know, hey, this is this first edition D&D without having to say it's first edition D&D. And just put it all out there as an open source Creative Commons kind of thing and let people develop with it. It's sort of like a legal loophole, right? A way to like cover everybody's asses. Like these guys put together this thing, put it out in the world and let everybody use it. And then, that way you can make first edition stuff. The introduction to the book is hilarious because it's very much like you could feel the nerves of Matthew Finch, who wrote the introduction, being like, we think we did this right. We're pretty sure that rules are uncopyrightable, but the words describing the rules are, so we stripped all of that out and we think we're good and we're going to do this thing. And hopefully we don't get destroyed by a lawsuit.
Yeah, man, here's hoping because lawyers are expensive.
Yeah. And so, they release this thing to the public. It's in the public domain. Essentially, it's free, distributed online in PDF form. And that's it. It just starts the movement. Suddenly, you get basic fantasy, you get Labyrinth Lord, you get swords and wizardry. The retro clone movement, when it happens, is like an explosion of all sorts of different retro clones. There's basic role-playing retro clone. Somebody does a phase rip, Marvel Superheroes retro clone. James Bond 007 for Victory Games. All these games get reworked, but the focus is from the very beginning is really on D&D. So all of those other retro codes, although they exist and people continue to tinker with them, the movement, the tide of this thing is always kind of tied to D&D, and it explodes out. It's crazy.
So basically my takeaway from this is the reason why it wasn't officially Gary, and Gary kind of showed you could get away with it, because when Gary did D&D, it was like Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell. And then many moons later, he comes back with Castles and Crusades, which would be Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell 2, Bat into Hell, whereas Osric went and kind of did their own version of Bat Out of Hell, which is more like Cat in a Well, so they could get away with it.
Yeah, it's definitely like in Magnum, the first 6 seasons, there's no actual licensed music. It's all like session bands, like playing really bad covers of songs, and just bad enough so that you're like, no, that's not the Rolling, is it? No, it's not the Stones. So it's like that. Yeah,
it's not quite Loverboy because I didn't think everyone was working on the weekend.
And yeah, like that's all the OSR really is in its inception is a sort of end run around the corporate powers that be hope we don't get sued because we really like to play the game this way plan. It's like the A-Team making like a crazy montage of like guys welding together the first edition rule books to save the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me because, up until this, I thought you could copyright a rule set. That's why, like, there's never really been, to my knowledge, like a knockoff of like Clue or Monopoly or things of that ilk. Like, I would just imagine that. I mean, what year did 3.0 come out?
1999, 2000.
Okay, so like at that point, I would imagine that no one had done it to that point because, like you said, no one thought they could do it. But could you get away with that, you think, if it was owned by, say, the Mouse and not WotC?
There's early precedent for it. Arduin really leans into the this is for D&D aesthetic, for OD&D. It's the same size books printed on the same kind of paper. It's referring to D&D rules and building off of them. There was a little bit of legal drama there, but they didn't sue Hargrave out of existence because I think they knew they would lose. And, that was the really early days. So like that was a measured response. Later on, when TSR has all the money and they regularly threaten lawsuits and stuff, I think that, like they would have thrown their weight around and tried to like convince you to fold with like a cease and desist, rather than bring it to court. I do think the copyright law is very clear on this. You can't copyright mechanics. And there is a ruling about Monopoly, specifically about the trademarks and stuff and how that kind of stuff works. So like can go at somebody big and win. It just takes money. And that's the thing that kind of freezes it and makes everybody unsure, because I don't want to get sued. Like I think that if it was 1985 and Dungeons and Dragons was owned by Disney, they would probably sue you for coming out with like Dungeon and Dragon, But I think ultimately, if you had the bankroll to fight them, they would lose.
And that's really all it comes down to in the end of the day is who's got the bigger wallet. It's not even right being on your side. And, you said it, copyright law, it is actually on your side. It's just, can you outlast Daddy Hasbro in a court battle?
It's just like fair use. Fair use is like a really powerful counter argument. It's an excellent defense, but it's a defense. You got to use it when you're in court, when you're getting sued. And like, who wants to risk that? Nobody. Because it's expensive and you're liable for so much more.
Yeah, I mean, I don't watch court shows. I watch mystery programs. So I'm confident I would lose had I been taken to court. So yeah, I wouldn't want to tussle with the giant. No way. Now, all of this said, do you think something like Osric, Castles and Crusades, the things that ushered in the OSR movement, do you think that worked out in Wizards' favor by letting this all go public and being like, hey, here's the OGL, go forth and do with it what you will? I mean, we're looking at this through the lens of Dungeons and Dragons as an intellectual property is bigger than it's ever been. And I say that with complete confidence. I mean, they send us the PDFs of the sales reports and like, this is what we did all year. The Rocks play Dungeons and Dragons. So like, we are saying this from a place of pure knowledge coming to our emails directly from corporate WotC. Like, do you think though that, in the long run, D&D would have gotten to where it is in the 2020s without the OGL going so public and letting more people have a little more freedom to make the games the way they want to make their games?
So I think that the OGL was a colossal error on Wizards' part. They did it in service of the D20 system, and they didn't really think through the repercussions. The intention was to create an ecosystem not unlike what they have now, with like the storefront, with people producing stuff for the storefront, and like it all being sort of like a walled garden for D&D stuff, right? But that's not what happened. Like, I don't think that they anticipated just the wild west of the D20 system taking off the way it did. I don't think anybody saw the retro clones coming. The OGL also, you can't revoke it. Once they did it, there was no language in it to undo it. And you could see with the 4th edition version of this that they did try to kind of put the genie back in the bottle because there were restrictions. It wasn't compatible with the original OGL. And it didn't work. Like, people still kept doing the thing because they realized like They waved the white flag and said, we won't sue you, and there's no takebacks.
Yeah, you would think that the people who came up with the wish spell would never allow the players to have it in real life.
They created one of their biggest competitors. Pathfinder, Paizo leverages the OGL to create Pathfinder, which really, I think it took it to Wizards of the Coast in a way that they weren't ever expecting over the 4th edition years. Like it was a real existential battle between those two editions, in my mind anyway.
I think at the gaming table as well, because there definitely was a schism between the two very distinct and very different games at that point, because, where you have Paizo leaning fully into the style of play that was perfect for that OGL feel, you had 4th edition, which was essentially Warcraft with miniatures at a gaming table, and to each their own. Everyone has a different vibe and feel and play style that they like. So, that's great because you actually give everyone the opportunity to play it their way. But man, it was just kind of like WWE being like, oh, here, WCW, come back from the dead. Just give us competition again. Like, wow, that's tough.
Yeah. And even though I think that Pathfinder has sort of plateaued or leveled off in a way that it's certainly not competing with 5th edition the way it was against 4th edition, but I do think that the OSR as a wide umbrella doesn't mean much as like a descriptor anymore. I'm dubious that it meant much as a descriptor after the first year or two, because it contains too many multitudes, but it still matters right now in this moment, because when you're not playing 5th edition D&D, you're essentially playing OSR. It's everything but 5th edition, right? So like it has spawned this massive competitor. And if you look at the creativity and the way it's cross-pollinated, things are completely different. Dungeon Crawl Classics comes out of this. You wouldn't have Dungeon Crawl Classics if there wasn't the OGL. There's all these strange games. UVG, Electric Bastion Land is essentially D&D stripped to the bone. All of this stuff is creative in a different way, in a way that it feels vibrant and exciting in a way that 5th edition doesn't, especially now that 5th edition has some legs on it. Like you have this sort of decentralized thing that you're competing against that's constantly pumping out the freshest ideas, It doesn't have the market share of 5th edition, but I think that like it's a machine that they accidentally built that will perpetually siphon off their customers. Whether it happens in numbers where it matters, who knows? But I do think that they accidentally, hubristically created the thing that might one day destroy them.
Well, here. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Osric?
No, not really. I think that's about it. It's such like an inflection point in terms of it's important because of what it is, what it started. But as a product, it's really just 1st edition. And it's a pretty good reimagination of 1st edition. It's very true to the thing. Like I said, I don't think that there was an expectation that people would play Osric. I think that people were always expecting to play 1st edition D&D, and that Osric was like this weird legal end run around, the OGL and Wizards of the Coast, sort of testing the limits of things in a fun, almost hacker-like way that I really appreciate. But I think that's Osric's legacy is much bigger than itself.
Right on. Well, this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I post stuff about things like Osric, although I have to be much more brief because I only get like 200, 300 words on Instagram.
You do get a lot more time on the air. You can find me over on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. Sometimes I pop on Twitter, sometimes I don't. It's the same handle, though, John McGuire RPG. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. If you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes. We've got a killer Discord community that's private for our patrons. It's public for everyone else, and we'd love to chat with you either way. We've also got, and this is pretty cool, a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book that's going to be coming out eventually. Is it this year?
It is this. You know what chapter I just finished?
What chapter did you finish?
The one on Osric.
Oh, well, and that's why we're doing the episode tonight. Wow. You also get a look behind the scenes at my game 321 Action, the first story that we're putting out for that, Rocket to Russia. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.